moving into the fifth unit and moving into as well the last period for the 2020 AP test, since again it only goes up until 1900, 1750 to 1900, and we're starting with a massive change in how people think about the world, and how people think, especially about human relationships with the Enlightenment, right? And to kind of just briefly define the Enlightenment, right? We see the emphasis of reason over tradition, and individualism over community values, right, over tradition and community. It's kind of our main idea of the Enlightenment, and it really comes down um, from previous movements such as humanism and the scientific revolution, right? Kind of the to kind of recap or summarize even more, individualism, freedom, is kind of a key idea. Self-determination, also very important in the Enlightenment. Okay. And they're going to really challenge the roles of the monarch, right? Challenge kings in the church, right? In their role in society, their power in society, and really helps leads to revolutions in specifically the United States and France, but also some other places as well, such as Haiti, and the abolishment of serfdom, right? Okay. So as I said previously, right, kind of grew out of the Renaissance idea of humanism, right? The idea that individuals are important, as well as the scientific revolution that followed the Renaissance, right, which also stemmed from the Renaissance ideas of exploring the classics, right? Scientific revolution was all about finding order in the world, right? Right. So we see they're not godless, right? But they do emphasize more. They emphasize the human accomplishments, and using those human accomplishments and the human capacity to understand the natural world, right? And so what we then see is kind of the extension of the scientific revolution, right? The concept of natural laws like gravity, right? There are also natural laws of social and political spheres, right? Social and political life, right? That there are natural laws that humans have, right? And so we also, due to the Enlightenment, and especially due to especially kind of asking questions about how social and political life are dictated, like what those origins are. Um, what we could see that we have social and political life, like the way that works, right, leads to a lot of different philosophies. Okay. And so socialism, liberalism, conservatism, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on, right? And so we see a clash here, right? A clash between these new ideas and the kind of old structures and old structures of power, right? Will lead to revolution. And these revolutions usually have two goals in mind, right? The first one is independence from imperial powers, right, which we see in the United States, in Haiti, especially, and the Latin American revolutions, right, and then the establishment of the constitutional government, right. Okay, and we tend to see those successful, right, in many places, right. These revolutions will be these revolutions will be very important for creating new government styles in these former colonies, right? And then on top of this, right, another thing that develops out of this is nationalism. Right, nationalism also comes out of this, right, which is an intense loyalty to your culture, to share culture and language, which will. Culture, kind of the broader point, but language is like the major thing that connects people of a culture, right? Or at least according to these people, right? According to the people who are nationalists, right? And this threatens the European multi-ethnic empires, especially the Austrian Empire. Okay. All right. So let's start with the kind of the main thinkers of the Enlightenment, and so they talk about Francis Bacon and his ideas of scientific inquiry, and kind of from there we have the base ideas of empiricism, right? That you get knowledge from experience, right? From direct experience, from sensory experience, right? Okay. And then instead of using, tradition or religion, right, we instead use natural, observed data. Okay. And then these ideas will then extend into the ideas of the Enlightenment, right? And two major philosophers coming out of England or Britain, I should say, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Make some very important discoveries or concepts, right? Both of them view political life as a social contract. Okay, so I'm going to put this down here for both of them. Political life as a social contract. Right, what that means is that people gave away natural rights to a government, right, in order to get law and order from that government, right? So especially like kind of the legitimate use of force, especially, right, being probably the most base natural right people gave up, right? And so Hobbes talks about life is nasty, brutish, and short, and he actually believes that we should have kings, that kings are the best way to have law and order, right? But Locke went a little further, right? That citizens can revolt if the social contract is broken. Okay. And then he also kind of came up with the idea of what some of these more of the natural rights, right, kind of identified them a little bit more, life, liberty, and property. Okay. And then kind of just on top of this as a concept, as a more broadly philosophical concept, right, he came up with the concept of the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, right, that everybody is born with a blank slate. And then our kind of community determines whether we're going to be good or bad, right? Which is a big deal considering that people, nobility, ancestry was very important. Okay. So next up, we have the philosophers, basically philosophers, right? That are a group of thinkers and writers that they help popularize concepts that were kind of just taking the next step of the scientific revolution, right? They talk about Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and Adam Smith, and then several French thinkers who we want to focus on. Some of those right now. We want to focus on, first off, Baron de Montesquieu, who also has a pretty strong history in America, right? He is a very big fan of checks and balances, and he kind of he champions the idea of the separation of powers, right, between the three systems: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, right? And then we have Voltaire, who is incredibly well known from this era. Okay, so Voltaire. He is very much a big campaigner for religious liberty, religious freedom, as well as judicial court reform, right? Reforming how the courts work, especially in France, right? And his ideas of religious liberty greatly influenced the United States Constitution. They talk about how he wrote with kings and queens, but that's fine. And then another major figure in the French philosophes has to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who really tapped into the old social contract ideas, right? He expands on the social contracts. He writes about education, right? And then, but the key thing here is he comes up with the concept of the general will, right? The general will of a population, and that's a sovereign, right, king or a government is obliged to carry out the general will. Okay. And so Rousseau is probably one of the most influential thinkers of the philosophes and the Enlightenment in terms of his influence on revolutionaries, right? Especially, of course, in France. Okay. One of the most influential thinkers, I'm going to move him out of the philosophes, and he is a philosopher, but he's very different in terms of what he's talking about, is Adam Smith, who is he responds to mercantilism by calling for free trade, right? Not mercantilism, which again is the kind of attempt to export more than import, right? To gather precious metals, right? He also believed in laissez-faire economy, right? A laissez-faire economy basically being a government, so less government in the economy, right? Very few restrictions. He's not saying full laissez-faire. He does believe that there is some role for the government in the economy, right? But they should reduce their interventions, right? And then he also came up with the invisible hand of the market, right? Basically saying if everybody acts in their own self-interest, right? If everybody acts in their own self-interest, then the economy will make choices. The invisible hand, right? The hand makes choices beneficial to society. Okay. And so his ideas of all this, right? He kind of provides the foundation for one of the most important aspects of modern society, and that is capitalism. Right? He helps shift away from mercantilism into capitalism, right? Capitalism being this situation where the means of production, right, such as the factories and resources, are owned by privates, are privately owned and for profit, right? Okay. Now, kind of unifying a lot of these guys together. Actually, I'm going to skip that. I want to go to this last person here. I want to go to Thomas Paine, who obviously wrote Common Sense, right? He advocated for liberty for the American colonists in the U.S., but then he also was very anti-Christian, right? Or not anti-Christian, but anti-church, right? He defends the religion of deism in his book, The Age of Reason, which made him very unpopular, right? But what is deism, right? Is that we have a God, a divine being, set natural laws in motion, and then kind of let it go, right? And of course, the always used analogy here is is God as a watchmaker, right? Who makes the watch, but then once the watch starts ticking, it ticks until it no longer exists, right? Okay, so that's what deism was, and we see a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers following deism, right? Especially guys like Jefferson and Franklin, right? And so we also start to see the Enlightenment thinkers react to the ills going on in society, which we haven't talked about industrialization yet, but industrialization is occurring in this era. And so we're seeing increasing urbanization due to industrialization. And those two things together are leading to social ills, right? Lots of problems in these urban areas, right, where a lot of people are, such as poverty, poor living conditions and working conditions. Right, and then no political representation for the people in urban areas. Right, which means especially that the will of the people, the general will, is not being followed. Right, and so we see some, and this is where we really start to see a lot of those different ideologies come to the forefront. Right, we see, some people call for government regulations and programs. You see Christians talking about charity, right? But what we see come out of this is conservatism, right? Conservatism is the idea that traditional institutions create consistency, right? Tradition. So, and that's what is important for society, right? So we see traditional institutions as important, right? Will keep society stable. And so their reaction to all this was that the poor, the urban poor, need to just kind of change, right, and improve, right? That is what they believed in, right? Okay, so let me make sure. They talked about they said they were going to, okay, they are going to talk about those. All right, so that's one of our first ideologies of the era, okay? But another one, which is, maybe the almost exact opposite, is utopian socialism. And utopian socialism, and well, let's actually back up here a little bit. Let's just call it socialism, because utopian socialism is kind of the forerunner of socialism, right? So not confuse things, right? Let's just call it socialism, right? And what we see with socialism is a desire for public ownership of the means of production, right? Which include, again, things like factories and resources, right? So those are the things we're talking about when we talk about the means of production, right? And so they believe that this would be the best way for society to develop, right? And then the idea of creating ideal communities, right? Creating ideal communities to help lead to this public ownership of the means of production is a type of socialism, the first type of socialism, really, known as utopian socialism. Okay, and they talk about three guys here that are the kind of founders of utopian socialism. Oops, I did not want that color. I wanted that one. We got Henry de Saint-Simon, who believed that they could operate these very clean, healthy businesses if scientists and engineers and business owners could work together. Right. We also have Charles Fourier, who identified a bunch of passions that can make work better, and then Robert Owen, who created a bunch of utopian communities, especially New Lanark, Scotland, and New Harmony, Indiana. He focused on education for children, communal ownership of the property, and community rules. Right. Most of these fail, but there are some successes here. And then we have another group of socialists, the Fabian Society. And actually, the Fabian Society kind of predicts a little bit of where socialism is going to go in a lot of Western European states in the modern era, right? And that we can see they are what are called gradual socialists, right? That we can change society, right? We can change through parliamentary measures, right? Change through enacting laws within a capitalist and parliamentary society, right? Rather than having to create a utopian society, it can be changed over time, right? And it becomes incredibly very important in Western Europe going forward. Okay, another ideology that this is another one that kind of talked about and then said, hey, we'll talk about this later, is liberalism, and specifically classical liberalism. Right, classical kind of being like the old school, right? This is like the original variant of liberalism, and it has changed in many different ways, right? But some of the key ideas here are the belief in natural rights, right? Life, liberty, and property, as we talked about with John Locke. the belief in constitutional government, so getting away from kings and queens, which conservatives would absolutely not agree with, right? We see laissez-faire economics. Okay. We see reduced spending, right? Decreased spending on the military and churches, right? Just to kind of get away from those as institutions that kind of are propped up by the government, right? And so, yeah, we see classical liberalism kind of come head to head with conservatism, right? These two will kind of be at odds going forward, right? Socialism, kind of a little more extreme version of liberalism, or very much more extreme version of liberalism, right? And so we see those two butting heads a lot in governments, right? You'll see almost like them taking turns. You'll have a conservative government, and then the society will react, the general will react to that negatively or positively. But over time, right, we'll see it react negatively and switch to classical liberalism or modern liberalism. And then modern liberalism, well, the general will react negatively or positively to it. But over time, it'll eventually turn negative and see a switch back to conservatism, right? So they kind of almost balance each other out in a lot of societies, especially in the United States, right? And so they kind of talk about how the classical liberals pursue changes in Parliament and British Parliament to help kind of reflect the new patterns of society. But we're not going to go into too much detail on that. Another key ism, right? They talk about this, the age of isms. We got feminism coming to the forefront, right? And the Enlightenment really gave them the idea, right? Gave women the idea that they should have equality, right? Women's rights and equality based on the Enlightenment. Okay. They talk about Olympe de Gouges, the French writer, very important woman in the early feminist movement, who wrote a Declaration of the Rights of Woman and of Female Citizen as a direct counter to the French Constitution that was written, right? Or Declaration, excuse me. And then we have Mary Wollstonecraft in England, who's a big advocate of female education, right? Universal education for men and women, for boys and girls, right? Not just for boys, right? And so with the goal of full equality, right? We do see women eventually win the right to vote in 1828, but Mary Wollstonecraft is in the late 1800s or late 1700s, excuse me. So it's going to be a while. And then we have the very famous Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which is kind of the first gathering, the first meeting of the feminist movement, right? And then they declared that all men and women are created equal, right? That women should have the right to vote and the right to hold office. Which, little trivia, a woman is actually voted into the House of Representatives in the United States before women are even given the right to vote. They should be able to hold property. They should be able to be legal guardians of their children, right? And so this is a big moment in time for the women's rights movement, right? The feminism of the 19th century really begins the movement to having more rights and possibly being equal with men, right? Also, we have abolitionism, right? This is the movement to end Atlantic slave trade. In the United States, led by William Lloyd Garrison, he's a big kind of mover of this. And so we do see slave trade ended. They don't really talk too much, but we do see slave trade ended in the early 19th century by most places. Okay. And so once we see that, we start to see a pretty rapid decline of slavery. One of the only places where we actually see an increase in slavery is in the United States, right? Because of the having slaves have children, right? But we eventually see the end of slavery altogether in the Americas in Brazil in 1888, right? The United States in 1965 officially ends it with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Okay. We also see the end of serfdom throughout Europe. They kind of focus on some dates, but the one I really want to talk about, the French government abolishing feudal rights in the nobility in 1789. That's part of that's the beginnings of the French Revolution. But the key one is when Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, ends serfdom in 1861. Right, they're the last to end serfdom in all of Europe. Freeing 23 million serfs, and the book points out being the largest emancipation of people in human history. Okay. Our last ism, our last ideology of the 19th century is Zionism, right? And is the desire for Jews, especially in Europe, to have a homeland in the Middle East where their descendants or their ancestors lived, right, where their homeland was, where the Holy Land is, right? And the reason we're seeing this is because of the growth of anti-Semitism, especially in Europe, right? We've talked about it previously, especially in Spain, right? And so we see that the Jews start to believe that they're not necessarily safe in Europe, right? And it's not just in Spain, it's in Russia, and it's in France. It's all throughout, right? Western or all of Europe, right? And so this leads to Theodor Herzl creating the concept of Zionism, right? He's the founder of it. And it really picks up speed, Zionism, with the Dreyfus Affair in France in 1894. He's a Jewish military officer. He's a Jewish military officer in the French military. And he is accused of treason, right? Accused of spying for the Germans, right? And then it turned out, though, that his accusation was based upon forged documents, so he gets pardoned. But it kind of shows that there's a lot of anti-Semitism in France, which is frankly one of the safest places for Jews in Europe. So if it's like that in France, where is it like everywhere else, right? Of course, they had problems just trying to get the Holy Land. It was already controlled by the Ottomans and Palestinian Arabs, right? Controlled by the Ottomans, and Palestinian Arabs lived there, right? But what we're going to see is in the wake of World War II, the British will be able to take that land and give it to the Jews. Actually, after World War I, right, they will give it to the Jews, and leads to a lot of modern issues between Israel and their neighbors. And that is it. That is all the isms of this era. We got a lot. We got, obviously, all this stems from the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment is kind of the seed, and then out of this blooms a lot of isms: nationalism, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and its kind of branches: utopian socialism and the gradual socialism of the Fabians, and then feminism, abolitionism, and Zionism, which are more about gaining rights for certain minority groups within, especially within European societies or post-European societies in the Americas, right? But yeah, that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.